Even Pure Bliss may last only a moment. Written by Paula Minko. Prologue. A son's homecoming. Around the patio table, the Moreau family was lingering over the last of Leo's stories. His homecoming had lifted something in the air that had been missing. The late spring sun was easing down over the domain, slow and golden. Below, the valley had vanished into soft greens and pale whites. Cherry trees still holding their last blossoms, apple trees thick with the promise of what was coming. Grand-mère Moreau had cooked like it was a holy occasion, and the wine had been poured without restraint. The twins, Marcel and Laura, were relentless. They clung to every word their older brother said, begging for more. The dives off Atlantic cliffs, the treks through Finland's frozen silence, the mishaps in icy northern waters that got funnier with each retelling. Leo was glad to be back. He hadn't told them yet that he was planning to stay longer this time. How long? He wasn't sure, but in recent months, he had started to miss things he hadn't realized he'd left behind. Working alongside his father under open skies, the noise and laughter of his younger siblings, the quiet, everywhere-at-once presence of his grandmother, and the music and late-night talks with Elena. Elena was the only one not at the table. He turned to Julien. "By the way, Papa, is Elena on her way?" Julien glanced at the twins before answering. "Well, she was supposed to be here when you arrived. It was meant to be a surprise, but her flight was delayed." Leo couldn't help smiling. "Well, I'm probably the one she misses the most around here. She calls me more than anyone." Julien said nothing. He topped up Arnaud's glass. "I think I'm her favorite." The twins answered in perfect unison, without so much as a glance between them. "No, it's Papa." The whole table broke into laughter. Loud, warm, impossible to contain. Arnaud nearly lost his wine. Grand-mère Moreau shook her head, but the smile that escaped her face made no effort to hide. Julien smiled into his glass. Laura spoke first, once the laughter had settled. "You know what, Leo? Now that we're all here, I want to hear how Maman and Papa fell in love." Laura had always said exactly what she was thinking. "Yes, please," Marcel jumped in. "Papa never talks about it, and Grand-mère's already told us everything she knows." "And Maman just goes..." Laura shifted into a breathy sing-song voice, the accent pitch perfect. "There was love in the air." Leo looked at his father, then at his uncle Arnaud, whose eyes were already dancing. "Fair enough, les loustiques. You're right. These stories deserve to be told. Come on, let's move to the salon. I'll tell you everything." The twins leapt from their chairs. "Not until you've cleared the table," said Grand-mère Moreau without looking up from her plate. Later that evening, the salon settled into its own kind of rhythm. Julien and Arnaud had a chess game going. Grand-mère Moreau was knitting. Leo and the twins had claimed the best spot on the rug, cushions gathered, ready for the long haul. Leo let the silence set in for a moment. Then, in a low, half-mysterious voice, he began. "That year, your mother was a star among stars. Not just any star, the brightest one of all. And yet, deep down inside, she was carrying a secret she had never told anyone." Chapter 1. A Star Has Risen. That night, I had won everything. Los Angeles was hosting one of its legendary summits. Every great voice in American music was in the building. In their dressing rooms, in their reserved rows, in outfits that would own the magazine covers by morning. Once a year, they gathered us, the way the universe aligns the planets, once in a long while, just for one night. And that night, I was the one they were crowning. Not for a single or an album, but for a decade of work. Stages, tours across every continent, sales that had shattered every forecast. All of it against the odds. When the spotlight found me in the audience, At the sound of my name, something shifted in the room. I was used to the applause, but there was something else. A held breath first, then a rising wave, as though the entire hall had decided in the same moment that I had earned it. I stood with the smile they all knew, wide, radiant, instant. I crossed the room through the ovation, climbed the stage, took the trophy from the presenter's hands, and said the words I was expected to say. The crowd gave back what crowds give. Backstage, they were already lined up. The sponsor wall, the photographers, an endless rotation of smiling faces sliding in beside me, arm out, torso turned to its best angle. I'd tilt my head just so. The smile would land, the same one every time, identical, instant, perfectly aimed. The greatest day of my life. If nothing else, the day of my triumph. Back at the hotel, a handful of discreet guests were waiting in the lobby. Out of habit, I almost stopped to take a few selfies. But something was building inside me. A low, unnamed urgency pushing me forward, telling me not to stop. The elevator. The penthouse. I walked straight ahead, my 2 assistants behind me, as always. I crossed the suite without pausing, pushed open the bedroom door. Elena. Dana was holding out my phone. And the trophy. You forgot this. I took both without a word. The bedroom was silent. The city blazed behind the glass. I set the trophy on the dresser, and then nothing. A void. All I wanted was to stand there and not move. I was beginning to recognize this feeling, but I hadn't expected it tonight, not after being crowned. And yet here it was, sliding under my skin, quiet and creeping, ready to knock the air out of me. The fear came. I snatched up my phone. I needed to hear someone's voice, right now, anything to break the spell. But whose? Think, fast. Ryan. I knew he'd pick up. He'd been waiting for it. What I was really praying for was that he'd be present. For once. He answered on the second ring. Hey! Behind his voice, music, laughter, the acoustics of a big private space. Women's voices, close to the phone. Babe, congrats! Seriously, that's... A burst of laughter somewhere near him. He didn't bother covering the phone. It's Elena. She won. I know. More laughter. You still doing the label thing? He went on. Yeah. Cool. Might swing by later if it's not too... Hey! A woman's voice interrupted, closer. The muffled sound of a hand over the receiver. Hang on, he said to someone else. Then again. Where'd you go? I can't see you. There's... Hey, what's up? I hung up. Wrong call. I kept the phone in my hand. My fingers were shaking. Mom? No answer. I scrolled on. Chloe, maybe. Oh my God, Elena! I watched the whole thing. I was on the couch and I literally screamed. Hey, Chloe. Jake will back me up. I screamed so loud the neighbors... Anyway, listen. You know the Henderson thing on Saturday? The what? I couldn't keep up. The dinner. I told you about it. It's a whole saga. And I found this dress. It's Valentino. It's perfect. And I kind of... Don't be mad. I kind of dropped your name with them. And they said yes. So you just have to call tomorrow to confirm. She was talking at 100 miles an hour. No pause. No room for a reply. It's literally one call. 30 seconds. I'll handle the rest. Chloe. I know. It's your night. It's unbelievable. Your name is everywhere tonight. I closed my eyes. You okay? She said. You sound off. I'm fine. I pressed my hand to my mouth, holding back the sob that surged without warning into my throat. Because you should be happy. This is the thing, right? This is literally the thing. I drew a long breath and opened my eyes. The trophy still stood on the dresser, golden, cold. Yeah. So you'll call the showroom? I'll get Dana to do it. Perfect. Love you. Go celebrate. You so deserve this. She hung up. I didn't move. And something broke open. One sob first, then another. A tightness like a fist inside my gut. I bent forward slightly, my arms wrapped around my stomach. My shoulders were shaking. This was the thing, literally the Holy Grail, and I had chased it for more than 10 years. So why, even tonight, especially tonight, did I feel so far outside my own body? A knock on the door. Dana. Elena, car's here in 30. Should I start on the second look? I straightened up, hand across my face. One breath. Give me 2 minutes. Of course. I had to get out of this room, out of this silence. Pull yourself together, Elena. Never let them see what's underneath. It was one of my mother's favorite lines, one that had walked beside me every day since I was a girl. That night, one more time, I wore it like armor. I needed it to get through what was left of this night. And tomorrow, the vice tightened again. Let it go. Tomorrow could worry about itself. Chapter 2. A Small Island of Wildness. Paris came to me through the car window, like a promise you don't dare say out loud. Late April. The afternoon light was gilding the rooftops. The trees had come out, fully, recklessly, as though they'd been waiting for this exact day. The Seine caught the sun as the car crossed a bridge, and I stayed there, forehead against the glass, watching a city I barely knew, but that seemed to be reaching for me. My phone rang. Hey, Mom, I'm here. Landed safe. I know, sweetheart. I tracked your flight. You tracked my... I'm your mother. So, how is it? Peaceful. It's the first time I've come here without working, and it feels different. There's a real charm to it. Of course, it's Paris in spring. The car left the main roads and the streets grew narrower. Before long, the apartment buildings thinned out, giving way to discrete properties barely visible behind tall trees that canopied the road. And the house? Almost there. It's not big but gorgeous from the pictures I've seen. Mark says there's work to be done. Mark says that about everything. He's not always wrong. I didn't answer. I was watching the streets tighten further. Here and there, the road turned to old cobblestones that carried you back in time. Elena. I'm here. Take your time. Catch your breath. Don't forget why you're there. I know, Mom. Don't worry. Talk soon. The car slowed before a wrought iron gate old enough to have character. It swung open onto a long gravel drive that the car followed effortlessly up to a beautiful, luminous house. The facade was warm. Pale stone, tall shuttered windows, ivy climbing one wall in thick, orderly ropes. Above the front door, a wisteria was beginning to bloom, its violet clusters heavy and fragrant. I stepped out. Dusk had settled behind us, and the deep blue sky framed the house like something out of a painting. I was drawn to its charm, and I hoped I could make it a refuge, for a little while, at least. The next morning, the house woke before I did. Spring light was pouring through the tall windows. Marguerite, the housekeeper, moved through the ground floor with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has done this her whole life. 2 movers were finishing up in the back room. The house itself, in that morning light, was extraordinary. High ceilings, original parquet floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, a fireplace you could stand inside. I had never paid much attention to the small details that give a house its soul. Years of touring had taught me to drop my bags wherever the next show demanded. But here, everything felt different. More than the house welcoming me, I was different. As though I'd woken up that morning able to sense the spirit of a place for the first time. A coffee was already waiting in the small room off the kitchen. I took it and stopped in front of the large window that looked out onto the garden. In the morning light, it was both impossible and alive. Deep green everywhere. A climbing rose along the back wall, red, completely out of control. Wild yellow and violet flowers pushing up through the gravel path. Birds in the high branches of an old apple tree. I hadn't expected any of it. And something in the way the roses fought for space, in that gravel path buried under 2 seasons of growth, echoed inside me. Chaos. Beautiful. Completely untamed. My phone rang. Mark!
Morning. How's the house?
Perfect. The team did a good job.
Good. Marguerite taking care of you? Got everything you need?
Yes, the movers are still finishing up, but it's fine.
The studio. The piano's where you wanted it?
First thing I checked.
Good. So you're settled? You have everything?
I looked at the garden through the window. Almost everything.
The garden.
It's a jungle, Mark.
I know. That's exactly why I'm calling. I found someone. Highly recommended, best in the region apparently, and completely discreet. His crew should be there today.
Today.
This afternoon, I think.
Why wasn't this done before I arrived?
It was planned. And this is what planned means. They're coming today.
I've been here since last night, Mark. I would have liked to wake up to a garden that—
Elena.
I'm just saying.
You can't control everything.
I looked at the garden. My jaw tightened. We'll see. I hung up. I stood at the window a moment longer. Then I set down my coffee and went to the piano. The studio was almost bare. A few boxes were still stacked against the far wall. Tall windows on 2 sides, the garden visible through both. And the piano. My piano. Or at least, its twin. I listened to the room first. The quality of the silence. The studio had always been the most important room in any house I lived in. The one where I spent most of my waking hours. Until recently, anyway. Until these last months, when my fingers had started to tremble above the keys and my stomach knotted every time I had to sit down for a recording session. Had I played myself to the point of nausea? Was it possible to lose the thing that had always risen inside me? The melody, the impulse, the need? This beautiful piano, open and waiting in a sun-drenched room, was an invitation I couldn't refuse. A dare to break whatever spell had silenced me. I sat down and tried the opening bars of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Gently, I let my fingers drift across the keys, tracing from memory the chords of a melody I had played 1,000 times. Those first 4 measures, the descending line, almost a question. Then the theme arriving underneath, unhurried, sure of itself. My hands moved across the keys with the ease of deep memory. I wasn't performing. I wasn't exactly working either. I was doing something more private than either, like singing alone in your car, full voice, no guard up, because no one's there to see what the music does to your face. Outside, the garden blazed in the morning light. The red rose along the wall, the apple tree trembling slightly in a breath of wind, birds crossing the high branches. And I played. I filled the room with sound, with vibration, with an energy that fed me back. Somewhere inside me, a young girl was exulting, fingers racing across the keys, stumbling sometimes, attempting acrobatic runs, taking shortcuts, with no company but the music itself. Maybe it was that very joy, crashing headlong into the enormous, unexpected noise that came from outside, that turned so instantly to rage. The music died mid-phrase, cut in full flight. A chainsaw, from the garden. The sound had invaded the studio whole. I had asked for silence. The movers knew it, the entire household knew it. No noise before 10. That wasn't too much to ask. I looked through the window. 2 or 3 men were moving about the garden, chatting among themselves about what were surely trivial matters that did not remotely justify ripping me out of the only burst of inspiration I'd had in months. I closed the piano lid and all but ran outside. I went straight for the noise. The morning air hit me, but I didn't slow down. A man was working a chainsaw on a large branch that had fallen to the ground. His crew, 3, maybe 4 men, moved around him. He saw me coming and killed the engine immediately. The others looked up, startled. They were all watching me. "Stop! Stop that right now! All of you!" He set the chainsaw down.
Good morning.
"No! You can keep your good morning. I want silence. I was very clear about this. No noise before 10. Those were the instructions." He'd removed his safety goggles.
The house was informed. I sent her a schedule last week and everything was signed off.
"I only arrived last night."
I understand. And I'm sorry no one told you directly.
His apology was genuine. My anger dropped a notch. "Fine. Now that you know, pack it up and come back at 10. I turned to leave, relieved it was settled so quickly, already thinking about getting back to the piano.
That's not possible.
I stopped, turned back slowly. "Excuse me?"
We have a full day's work here. If we lose 2 hours at the start, we won't finish before dark, and I have another site tomorrow.
"That's not my problem."
No, it's mine. I'm just asking you to be understanding.
I stared at him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Surely I'd misunderstood. But no, his face was calm, his feet planted in the ground. He had said exactly what he meant. Was I supposed to be understanding? It was barely 8 in the morning. This was my garden, and this was a pretty good gig for him when you got right down to it. The nerve. "I don't think you understand the situation. This is my house, my time, and I've been very clear about what I need. Your schedule is of absolutely no concern to me.
With all due respect.
Either you work on my terms, or Mark will find someone more competent." For a moment, it seemed as though his face had turned to stone. He may even have stopped breathing. His crew stood perfectly still, following every word. I knew I'd raised my voice. I didn't care. I was within my rights.
More competent, madame?
That's what I said. He looked at me for a long beat.
You don't get to speak to me that way. I didn't cause this mess. Take it up with your own people.
He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. He turned to his crew.
Les gars, on range tout et on s'en va.
The crew moved. Within moments, they were gone. I stood in the middle of the garden. Around me, the overgrown roses, the buried path, the fountain choked with vegetation, the apple tree heavy with new leaves. Somewhere above me, a bird began to sing. It was the first time I had set foot in this garden, at the back of the house, where only an old stone wall separated it from the pond that bordered the neighborhood. I closed my eyes, just for a moment, letting this small island of wildness wrap itself around me. Then I went back inside. Chapter 3. A Proper Little Cafe. The next morning, the light was even more beautiful, utterly indifferent to my mood. I had settled into the small dining room off the kitchen. Same window as the day before, same garden behind the glass. The sky was luminous, almost scrubbed clean, and the garden's colors blazed in the light. The deep greens, the vivid red of the rose climbing the wall, scattered touches of violet, yellow, and white in the wild grass. Still beautiful, still untamed. Marguerite had laid out a proper breakfast, coffee, croissants, and an herb omelet. I ate slowly, noticing for the first time the bird song coming from the garden. That, too, was new. I'd barely slept. After the landscaping crew left the day before, the piano had given me nothing. I'd sat there for an hour, maybe longer, hammering at the keys, hunting for something that wouldn't come. I'd tortured Chopin, Ravel, and even some contemporary pieces. Nothing answered back. My phone rang. Mom. "Morning, sweetheart. How are you?" "I don't know yet." She laughed softly at my bad temper. Did you sleep? A little. The house is quiet. It helps. That's something. And the piano? Yesterday morning I got somewhere. A little, but nothing this morning. I can't pull anything decent out of it. It'll come. Everyone keeps saying that because it's true. You've been running flat out for 2 years, Elena. Give yourself some time. You can't expect everything to fall into place in 48 hours. I don't have time. The label wants... The label can wait. Let's talk about something else. How's the house? Good. I wrapped both hands around my cup before going on. Something happened yesterday. With the garden. What kind of something? Mark found a landscaper, best in the area apparently, and he showed up yesterday morning way too early with a full crew and a chainsaw. A chainsaw! And I was at the piano, and the noise was just unbearable. I couldn't play. I couldn't hear myself think. So I went out and asked him to stop, and it turned into this whole thing. What kind of thing? Long story short, he packed up and left. Hasn't come back. She didn't answer right away. Are you okay? I'm fine. He was arrogant anyway. Mark will find someone else. Of course, though that might take a few days. I know, which means the garden stays there looking like, I don't know, a jungle. It's been a jungle for a while, from what you've told me. A few more days won't hurt it. I looked at the garden through the window. The red rose, the buried path, the apple tree. You know, it's actually quite beautiful underneath it all. You can see what it could be. Good, sweetheart. She let a silence settle before continuing. Listen, I'll be there in 2 days, Thursday at the latest. But in the meantime, I don't want you sitting in that house staring at a silent piano or a wild garden. I know you're fine. Go out anyway. There's a place not far from you, Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Do you know it? No, I don't think so. Your grandfather used to take me there when I was little. There's a castle, a beautiful park. You can see the whole valley from the terrace. The Seine, everything. And the town has real character and real history. A beautiful church, lovely streets. It was a royal seat once, and it's kept its elegance. It's worth seeing. I said nothing. Put on something simple, grab your sunglasses, and walk. Get some air. What if someone recognizes me? You smile and keep walking. Honestly, on a Tuesday afternoon, this far from the Parisian avenues, people have their own lives to lead. I almost smiled. You make it sound easy. It is. You've just forgotten. A few seconds passed. Try one of the cafés near the chateau if you feel like it. Sit on a terrace, order something. Watch the world go by for an hour. It'll do you a world of good. I miss you, Mom. I miss you too. Thursday, I promise. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Now go, before you find a reason not to. She hung up, and I stood motionless by the window for a while, my gaze lost in the garden. Then I made up my mind. The park around the castle opened up like an invitation to breathe. Trees in full leaf, heavy with late April green, dense and close along the wide gravel alley. Following the well-kept paths downhill, I arrived at a terrace with an unbroken view of Paris stretching to the horizon, catching the afternoon light. I walked. I'd done what my mother told me. Jeans, a loose jacket, flat boots, a wide-brimmed hat, sunglasses. Apart from a few appreciative glances, no one paid me any particular attention. Around me, the park lived at its own pace. A man reading on a bench, 2 women pushing strollers, talking without looking at each other, children running along routes that only made sense to them, a dog crossing a patch of sunlight with considerable satisfaction. I watched all of it, and none of it belonged to my world. I had grown up in the American city. Wide avenues, noise, speed, dreams you chase at 100 miles an hour. Here, people walked as though time were something they owned. The buildings had been standing for centuries, and the streets had names that told stories. There was something in this town, so full of character, that was reaching me in a way I couldn't yet name. Little by little, my pace slowed and my breathing relaxed. I stopped at the balustrade of the terrace, looked out over the valley. I felt my whole body release a tension I hadn't known was there a moment before. It's easy to forget, in a city of skyscrapers, how vast the sky really is. But here, in a town that had understood the grace of growing old, the blue canvas stretched above everything, cloudless, unchallenged. I stayed there a long time, inside a different sense of time. A bird landed on the balustrade 3 feet from me, looked at me without the faintest interest, flew off. I decided it was time to do the same and walked toward the town. The streets of Saint-Germain-en-Laye were beautiful in that particular hour of late afternoon when the day exhales. Shop lights flickering on, the smell of pastry somewhere, families heading home. A handful of teenagers gathered on street corners with that specific idleness teenagers have on warm evenings. I drifted through it all slowly, past a bakery with an ornate hand-painted sign, a tiny shop selling newspapers and cigarettes, the kind the French call a tabac, and a small square with a fountain, the sound of falling water weaving into the hum of the street. From somewhere very close came the sound of a guitar, and beneath it, voices joining in on a chorus they all seemed to know. Technique be damned, but in perfect harmony. I felt an urgent pull to be near them, to let myself be carried by whatever joy they were sharing. I followed the sound to a corner cafe a few meters away, not the most elegant spot in the neighborhood, but one that made up for it with the kind of warmth only conviviality can give a place. I pushed open the door. Warm light, the smell of wine, coffee, and something cooking. A low ceiling with old beams. The back table had been pushed aside. 8 or 10 people, glasses in hand, singing at full volume. Exactly what I'd been looking for. I had spent my adult life in rooms full of music, arenas and studios where everyone held their glass carefully and nodded at the right moments. I had been surrounded by music professionally, constantly, for close to 20 years. What I was searching for today was something simpler. That unguarded good spirit, that easy warmth, that only music stripped of all pretense can carry. My eyes found the guitarist and I froze where I stood. The landscaper, the man with the chainsaw from the day before. Here, he was a completely different person. His whole body loose in the chair, one foot keeping time on the floor, his head following the rhythm. He played without looking at his hands, singing along with the others, entirely in the moment. The whole table picked up the chorus, louder this time, a fist on the table marking the beat, glasses trembling. A roar of laughter when someone lost the words completely and improvised something absurd. The guitarist shook his head, laughing, and kept playing. He had an open, unguarded laugh, the kind that doesn't bother being polite. The waitress appeared and broke my stare. Bonsoir, une personne? Yes. She led me to a small table by the window. I sat down and turned my chair, just slightly, to face the room. I took off my sunglasses and hat, completely at ease now. What can I get you? A coffee, please. The chorus was starting again. Someone raised a glass and a man came in late on the beat and didn't care. I watched the guitarist lean toward the man beside him and say something that made the whole table laugh. It was the music that had drawn me into this cafe, and this man carried it as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The waitress came back and set down the coffee. She stared at me briefly, but I didn't pay attention to her. Outside, through the glass, a girl was vaping, with a group of friends on the pavement. She started staring straight at me, tugged her friend's sleeve. A phone went up. I didn't register it immediately, but moments later, the group outside had grown large enough that people inside began to notice something unusual was happening on the other side of the glass. I turned my head. A cluster of young people, phones raised. The window between us suddenly felt paper thin, and my heart missed a beat. I grabbed my sunglasses and hat and stood up fast. I'd let my guard down, and things were about to spiral. Inside, the music faltered. Someone at the table looked toward the window, then another. The guitarist raised his eyes and found mine instantly. He set the guitar against the table without a word. Quick, alert. He crossed the cafe toward me, not a word spoken. I was already looking for a way out that didn't lead through the crowd outside. He held out his hand.
Come with me.
I put my hand in his. He went through the back of the cafe, past the bar, through a door that opened onto a narrow corridor. Another door, and we were outside, in a lane barely wide enough for a single car. I followed without question, my hand still in his. He took several different turns, cobbled back streets, old stone on both sides, completely deserted. He walked fast without running. I kept up. He slowed when the streets widened and other people reappeared. Before long, he turned into another lane and unlocked a blue pickup. We hadn't exchanged a single word since the bar. He started the engine and drove in silence. The town gave way to houses, then to estates. The road opened up. Trees on both sides, the evening light falling through them in long bands. The drive was no more than 15 minutes, but it was enough to find my breath again. The car stopped in front of the gate. I turned to him. Thank you. Really.
You're welcome. Will you be all right?
Those were the first words he had spoken since we left the cafe. I looked through the gate. The lights of the house were glowing at the end of the drive, and 2 security guards were approaching. Yes, they were just kids, nothing dramatic. A thought landed a smile on my lips. I don't even know your name. He looked at me with a faint smile.
Julien.
I let the name settle. Then I introduced myself. Elena.
I know.
This time, we were both smiling. I opened the door. The tall gate swung open before I reached it. Chapter 4. A Family Affair. The car moved steadily along the road. 20 minutes at most, the driver said. And the way was clear. It was still early for Saturday. The road out of town unfolded in stages. The last houses, a roundabout, then open fields. Now and then clusters of near-identical houses appeared, marked by their sameness, with the occasional church steeple for those villages old enough to have one. As we neared our destination, orderly rows of trees began filing past the window. Not a forest, more like a vast orchard. Rows of young pines, close and regular. Then cherry trees, taller, their branches still carrying the last white blossoms. Then apple trees, massive, ancient, in full leaf. The rows climbed the hillside one after another, hundreds of trees, maybe more. Nature shaped by human hands, but soothing all the same. The morning sun playing above the branches lent the whole scene a gentleness that settled over you. The air smelled of earth and sap, and something sweet I couldn't name. The driver slowed, and a wooden sign, elegant, hand-carved, appeared by the road. Moreau and Fils. The car turned in through the main entrance, a wide opening in the stone wall that ran along the road, and followed a gravel drive toward a parking lot. The main building stood facing us, large, solid, built of pale stone and glass, with a tall, conical glass atrium at its center, its metal and glass frame rising to a point against the sky. Low, long wings extended on either side, with an upper floor visible through the high windows. Offices, perhaps. In front of the entrance, on the gravel, rows of terracotta pots, bags of compost stacked on pallets. I stepped out of the car. Behind the building, I could make out greenhouses, 4 or 5 of them, their gabled glass roofs catching the backlight. And beyond those, behind the greenhouses, behind everything, the same rows of trees I had seen from the road, the nursery, the orchards climbing the hill. And perhaps, Much further still, the ones that had lined the road itself. Higher up the slope, set back from the rest, another building bore the word restaurant. So this was Julian's. The domain was large but not excessive, elegant without showing off, and rooted fiercely in the land. But I'd already understood that much. I walked through the front doors of the main building. It was a showroom. The inside lived up to the outside. What struck me first was the light. It seemed to come from everywhere, pouring in under the great conical atrium. Warm wood on every surface, the beams, the display tables, the shelving. Climbing plants trained along the ceiling joists. The air was cool and green and faintly sweet, the same scent as on the road, 15 minutes earlier, but concentrated. Hand-painted labels, tools displayed with the care people reserve for things that are meant to be used. A small woman of a certain age moved between the tables, adjusting things, giving quiet instructions to the staff around her. It was still early. I was probably one of the first visitors. She looked up when I came in. Let me take a moment, let my eyes wander. Then she came over, a smile on her lips. Bonjour, madame. Je peux vous aider? She had spoken in French, of course, and I tried to answer in kind. Bonjour, je cherche Julien? She tilted her head slightly, switched to English. Do you have an appointment? No, not at all. Actually, he doesn't know I'm coming. I can come back later if he's busy. I'd already considered that possibility. Something shifted in her expression, barely. Interest. He's with some clients right now. It might take a while, but you're welcome to wait. Would you like something to drink? No thanks, don't bother. She was already turning back to her plants when she called out toward the staircase. Leo. No answer. Leo, she said louder. A young man appeared further along the aisle. The woman spoke to him in French, about me, clearly. I caught the gist without understanding every word. He glanced at me for a very brief moment. He instantly flushed, and a flicker crossed his eyes. He'd recognized me. I probably should have kept my sunglasses on. But he recovered, with a composure that impressed me for his age. Hi. He spoke to me in English, with the best accent I'd heard since arriving in France. I'm Leo. Elena. Want to see the place? I'd love to. Come on. He walked through the domain the way you walk through a place you know by heart, without watching where he was going, talking without turning around, adjusting his path around obstacles without breaking stride. I followed. I was looking at everything. The showroom is the front of house, mostly Grand-Mère's territory, as you saw. So, the woman in the poppy print apron was his grandmother, and the boss. Was she Julian's mother? He led me the length of the showroom, stopping here and there to explain something or tell a story. He gestured toward the greenhouses. We grow about 60% of what we sell in these greenhouses. The rest comes from suppliers in the region. My dad's pretty strict about that. Nothing from more than 300 kilometers away. Why? He seemed slightly surprised that I'd asked. Soil compatibility. And he doesn't like things that have traveled too far to get somewhere. His father. Was his father Julian? Or another Moreau? We passed the first greenhouse. Leo pulled the door open. A rush of warm, humid air, the dense and layered smell of things growing. Inside, there were rows of seedlings, young plants at different stages, and an irrigation system running along the ceiling. A young worker looked up, nodded at Leo, and went back to work. This one's for the residential projects. The next one's for the big contracts, local councils, sports facilities, that sort of thing. I waited. And now there are projects in Belgium, too. Uncle Arnaud runs those. We came out the far end of the greenhouse, into the open air. Ahead of us, the nursery. A few hundred young plants in containers, sorted by size and species, each row marked with a handwritten wooden sign. And beyond it, climbing the hill, the orchard. The same cherry and apple trees I had watched from the car window a short while ago. The nursery is the replacement stock. But the orchard? That's the heart of it. He swept his arm wide. Over 1,000 trees. Some of them take years before they bear fruit. My great-grandfather planted the first ones. I looked at the rows climbing the hillside, the horizon beyond. Over 1,000 trees. Years of growth. A great-grandfather who had started something that was still bearing fruit. Leo was watching me. It's beautiful. We walked in silence for a while, between the rows of young trees. I assumed Julian was mainly a landscaper, but it's much more than that. Yes, landscaping's part of it, but it's not really the core. Papa would explain it all much better than me. So, he was Julian's son after all. Your English is really good. That's unusual around here, from what I've noticed. Thanks. We lived in London when I was small. I was actually born there. It surprised me to learn that Julian had once left all this behind. Really? Until I was 8. We left when... He hesitated, then caught himself. We left 8 years ago. So Leo was 16. The subject was clearly sensitive. I shouldn't press. He bent down to straighten a pot, tidy a tool. I didn't hold out long. Do you remember much of it? Yeah, bits. Mostly the nannies. There were a lot of nannies. He said it lightly, not entirely lightly. Your parents were working. My dad was building the London side of the business. It was going well. He had a lot on. A whole different world from what we have here. Actually, my parents split up. My mom, she gave my dad custody and went back to Thailand. He said it simply, picking up a twig from the ground and snapping it in two, absently. We walked on in silence for a few steps. My dad decided to come back, move back in with Grand-mère so I'd have... He made a vague gesture at the domain around us. All of this. Instead of a flat and a new nanny every 3 months. He let that sit for a beat. I got the better deal, clearly. I held his gaze. This boy. 16 years old in this quiet clarity. He looked at the trees. A smile played at his lips. I mean, London's great for holidays, but I wouldn't trade this for a flat anywhere. I looked at the orchard, the greenhouses below, the main building with its glass atrium. Grandma Moreau was visible through the showroom window, back with her plants. I understand. We were nearly back at the main building when his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and put it away without answering. That'll be my dad. He must be done. He nodded toward the building. Come on. Julian was coming out of the building with 2 clients, well-dressed, suit and tie. He finished his sentence, shook their hands, and walked them to their car. Then he turned and saw me standing in the courtyard, next to his son. Leo gave his father an almost imperceptible shrug, and disappeared through the door, not without saying goodbye. Julian looked at me. I offered him an open smile. Bonjour, Julien. I should have called first.
Bonjour. Don't worry about it.
His eyes caught the blue of his shirt. I owe you an apology. I went way too far the other day. I was wrong to speak to you the way I did, and to your team. I was on edge. The move, the piano not responding, the noise, none of that was your problem. You were doing your job. I'm sorry. Still silent, his gaze resting on me as though trying to read my thoughts. A bird started singing somewhere in the orchard.
I appreciate you coming to say that. We all have days when nothing goes right. It's forgotten.
The moment hung between us. The garden still needs doing. I smiled. And Mark says you're the best. The beginning of a smile reached his lips. He decided to accept the compliment.
Mark knows what he's talking about.
I tilted my head slightly, watching him, waiting for his answer. The message was clear.
All right.
I can try shifting the piano to the afternoon
No
if...
need. Your hours will be mine.
I nodded. He held out his hand and I took it. The same hand as in the back street in Saint-Germain a few days earlier. Chapter 5. A Mother's Intuition. Giselle Moreau had not spent a day without her flowers in 45 years. From the moment her husband had taken over the small family nursery, she had given it her days and sometimes her evenings, summer and winter alike. Sowing, planting, measuring, harvesting, doing the books, the cleaning, the maintenance, the deliveries. Until very recently, she had done every job the domain required, at one time or another, across the whole of her long life inside the Moreau family. She had married young, barely 20. Nothing unusual for their generation. Besides, she and Leonard Moreau had known each other all their lives. Many, like Giselle's parents, had profited from the region's rapid urban development and found themselves at the head of considerable estates. Others, like Leonard's parents, had clung to their family land alone and to farming, and were swept away by the first tremors of the crises that still shake French farmers today. When Leonard, an only child, inherited the family farm, he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He turned the fields into orchards, opened educational farms, and offered gardening services to all the new city dwellers who still craved green without straying too far from Paris. Giselle's parents invested alongside him, and the results came quickly. Not without setbacks, not without failures, but he had seen what was coming. Arnaud had always known he would work for the domain and had followed the path laid out for him. Julien was a different story. He had needed to find his own way. Barely out of university, he had left for Barcelona, then London, to study architecture. Then one day he had called her to say that his girlfriend was pregnant and that they were getting married. He was 22. Leonard had been dead for 5 years. She hadn't had the heart to reproach him. She had simply booked a flight to London. The situation was more complicated than her son was willing to admit. The young woman, clearly in love with him as she was Thai and had no settled status in England. And then there was Leo, her eldest grandchild. She was in London the day he was born. When she had held him for the first time and Julien had said simply, "His name is Leo," she hadn't been able to hold back her tears. In the 8 years since Julien and Leo had come to live with her, she could not have been happier. But she also worried, quietly, that her son showed no sign of wanting to build a home again. The young woman's visits seemed to have shifted something, like a sign. Giselle watched them in the courtyard and sensed the Julien she hadn't seen in years. Whoever this woman was, she was not a matter of indifference to him. Leo came through the door just then. "Tell me, Leo, do you know that young woman? Is she a friend of your father's?" "You don't know who she is? I'm asking you." Leo hesitated for a second. "That's Elena Rivera. Well, Rivera's the stage name. She's an American musician, very well known right now. She composes for herself and for other artists, and she sings a bit too." Giselle shifted a pot of lavender a few inches to the left. She just won a huge award in the States. Her face is pretty much everywhere at the moment. Giselle nodded without a word. Her hands went on working, automatically, with the precision of a woman who has been arranging flowers for 50 years. "I wasn't expecting to find her here," Leo added, "and definitely not expecting her to know Papa." Giselle said nothing. Outside, Julien and Elena were exchanging a few words by the car. Elena was smiling. Julien too, barely, but it was there. Giselle watched a moment longer, then returned to her flowers. That evening, the domain kitchen smelled of thyme and roast chicken. Giselle served the plates without ceremony. Julien, Leo, and herself, the usual weeknight arrangement. They had their routines, the three of them. Giselle insisted that dinner be taken together. Leo ate with the appetite of a 16-year-old who had spent the afternoon outdoors. Julien ate more slowly, eyes on his plate. Giselle waited until dessert before raising what interested her. Patience was a quality she had cultivated early, and it had always served her well. "Who was the young woman who came to see you this morning?" Julien looked up.
A client.
"I see." She set down a plate of cheese for Leo. Very charming, on top of being very beautiful, wouldn't you say? Julian didn't answer. His eyes stayed on his plate. That's the client who asked you to leave, rather rudely, as I recall. The silence returned. Leo kept his gaze fixed on his fork with remarkable discipline.
Yes.
Giselle picked up her water glass, took a sip, set it down. I do believe you've caught her eye.
Maman, don't go imagining things. She was just asking me to take her project back on. She was being polite.
Giselle did not smile. She looked at him with the quiet steadiness that was her signature, the one that meant no one in this family ever contested the last word when it came from her. All the more to her credit. She said nothing more. She remembered an African proverb her husband used to repeat, something along the lines of, "An old man sees more sitting down than a young man sees standing up." The next morning, Elena's house smelled of coffee and the cut flowers Marguerite had placed around the salon. Laura had arrived the evening before, and the reunion between mother and daughter had stretched well into the night. This morning, they were both in the salon. Laura sat on the sofa with her coffee, legs tucked under her. Elena settled beside her. The house is even lovelier in daylight, isn't it? It's not big, but that's part of the charm. It wears its coziness well. Elena answered with a smile. Laura thought she looked strangely at peace, a far cry from the tension she'd been carrying a few days earlier. Have you heard from Ryan? No, not at all. That was a short answer. Elena leaned forward to pick up her cup from the coffee table, took a slow sip. He keeps calling, actually, but I don't have much to say to him. Laura wasn't surprised. Elena didn't attach easily to men. Music always came first. But maybe it was time for that to change. Elena, Marguerite knocked lightly before appearing in the doorway. I'm sorry to disturb you, madame. The landscapers have arrived? Elena sprang to her feet, as though a spring had launched her out of the sofa. Thank you, Marguerite. Could you put together a thermos of coffee for them, please? She was already moving toward the terrace. Laura watched her cross the salon, the speed, the eagerness, something in her stride that had nothing to do with coffee. Laura stayed seated, turned her head toward the window. Outside, in the garden, a crew was unloading equipment from a van parked in the drive, and among them, a man in work clothes, dark-haired, broad shoulders, giving instructions in a low voice. Elena appeared on the terrace. The man looked up, a smile, discreet, natural. Laura watched them for a moment, the space between them. The way her daughter held herself felt different, straighter, and at the same time looser, more present. Elena came back into the salon a few minutes later, quietly unsettled. Laura took a sip of her coffee. He's very handsome, that gardener. What's his name? Julian. It's a family business, actually. They do much more than landscaping. It's a whole world built around the land. Very much worth a visit. You've been? Laura looked at her, genuinely surprised. Why? You know I told you about our argument. Well, I was wrong. He's nothing like arrogant. She told her briefly. The café in Saint-Germain, the guitar, the crowd outside. How Julian had helped her, without a word, despite what had happened the day before. So I went first thing yesterday morning to apologize. His son showed me around, and I met his mother too, on the way in. Anyway, we're back on good terms. Laura listened carefully. Good, I'm glad. She raised her cup to her lips. And the fact that he's extremely easy on the eye doesn't hurt. Mom? Laura smiled into her cup. Elena shook her head, but she was smiling too. Chapter 6. Anything but naive. Julian arrived the next morning with his crew, and from that day forward, the garden began to shed its skin. Not all at once. Gardens never change all at once, but in stages. First, the heavy work. Julian's team cleared the paths, cut back the roses, and freed the fountain from the vegetation that had been strangling it. Then the finer things. Borders redrawn, flower beds turned over, water running again in the fountain. A thin, bright thread of it falling with a sound like singing into the basin. That first week, the crew came 6 days out of 7. They'd stay 3 hours, sometimes 4, though Julian himself left earlier. An hour or 2 at most. The tall French doors along the ground floor gave me a clear view of the garden, and I was always aware of their presence, always watching the work take shape. It was from my bedroom upstairs that I had the best vantage point. The wild grass retreating day by day, giving ground to something more intentional. Every morning I saw Julian, and sometimes heard him. He wasn't much of a talker, but he never stood apart from the work, pulling, clearing, digging alongside the rest of the team. I can't remember exactly when the coffee started. One morning, I'd brought out a thermos for the crew, and it became a ritual. I knew the regulars by name now, and Julian had taken to serving himself last, then staying beside me on the terrace, sipping his coffee at the same pace as mine. We'd stand there a few minutes, side by side, facing the garden, talking about the work in progress. He'd explain what the crew was doing, what was going to plan, and what wasn't. He wanted to know what I thought of this arrangement or that one, the colors, the scents. The more I listened, the more I noticed the blue-green of his eyes, the line of his jaw. His voice so low and steady, it seemed to hum at a frequency all its own. My mother joined us sometimes. She and Julian got along immediately. Her French was good enough to make herself understood, which had won her the friendship of the entire household staff, as well as Julian and his crew. On the Saturday of the second week, early May, I saw him arrive alone, no crew, his arms full of flowers. I went out to meet him without a second thought for my mother, whom I'd just abandoned mid-sentence. He was kneeling at the far end of the garden, in front of a freshly turned bed. He looked up. Morning, Julian.
Bonjour, Elena.
Your men have the Saturday off?
They work every other Saturday, and only when we've got a lot on.
In front of him on the ground, seedlings in small pots, rows of them, carefully laid out on a cloth. Tulips, violets, pansies, and other things I didn't recognize. He saw me looking.
I've brought your tulips and your violets.
He picked up a pot of tulips, deep purple, almost black at the center.
Tulips bloom first. They announce that winter is over. They don't last long, 3 weeks, maybe 4. But while they're here, you can't look at anything else.
He set them down, picked up the violets.
Violets come at the same time, but they stay. They're quieter, lower to the ground. Most people don't even notice them next to the tulips. But when the tulips are gone, it's the violets that hold the bed.
He dug a hole with the trowel, quick, precise.
The idea is that the bed is never empty. There's always something in flower, or coming up, or coming back. No dead season.
He planted the first pot, pressed the earth around it. His hands were sure and gentle at the same time.
Color matters too. Purple and white together create depth. Yellow next to purple wakes everything up.
I watched him work, his hands in the soil, that quiet focus.
Want to try?
He held out a pot and the trowel. I took both and knelt beside him, dug a hole, too wide, too deep.
Tighter. The soil needs to hold the root, not drown it.
I tried again. Better. Like that?
Like that.
It struck me that I hadn't put my hands in the earth in years. Not since I was a child, probably. I may have said as much out loud without realizing, because he answered.
For me, it's a kind of therapy. Probably the way music is for you. I plant, I uproot, I replant. I live with the rhythm of the seasons and it does me a world of good. Even in the dead of winter, I'm working the soil. Maybe that's how you feel about music.
A smile landed on my lips before I could stop it. It was the first time I'd heard him talk about himself at any length. I suppose so, yes. Music can feel like therapy. Depends on the music. But I can't remember the last time it made me feel this good. I stopped, startled by a thought I had just made terribly real by saying it out loud. I wasn't expecting him to answer.
Maybe it's like the seasons, or the lunar cycle. There are days to plant certain things, days for others, and days when you shouldn't plant at all, and just wait for conditions to improve.
I looked at him, not entirely sure I followed. It must have shown on my face because he went on.
Maybe you just need to plant something different, or be patient.
He laughed, a slightly self-conscious laugh, and got to his feet, pulling me up with him.
I'm done for today. I should head off. Say hello to Laura for me.
He had kept my hand in his longer than he needed to. Then he left. I walked back toward the house and saw my mother, Laura, standing at the French doors. She may well have watched the whole thing. I decided not to comment. The following week, he arrived with a drawing. A plan of the garden, sketched by hand on heavy paper. The paths, the flower beds, the fountain, the back wall with its rose. And in a corner I had never noticed, between the east wall and an old lilac, an empty space.
There's a spot here we haven't talked about yet.
He pointed to the corner in question.
The lilac makes a natural wall on one side. The stone wall makes the other. If we add a trellis, with a climber, jasmine for instance, we close the third side, and you get an alcove.
An alcove?
A private space, somewhere to sit, sheltered from the rest of the garden, out of the wind, a little apart from everything. Add a garden swing, and it becomes the perfect retreat.
I looked at the plan. Then I looked at the corner of the garden, the lilac in bloom, the old wall, the gap between the two. He took out his phone and showed me pictures.
It'll be your corner, a place to breathe, away from prying eyes. I saw a lot of these when I was working in England.
Did you? He rolled up the plan, put away his pencil.
When I lived over there, I kept seeing them in English gardens. Small enclosed spaces, hedges, trellises, sometimes just a brick wall and a climbing rose. There's something elegant about it. A kind of romance, too.
I hesitated. Leo told me a little about your time in England. He looked at me, a flash of surprise in his eyes.
He did?
Not much, just that he was born there, and that you gave it all up to give him a different life, here. It wasn't the whole story, but I was deliberately leaving out what belonged to his truly private life. Julian was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting over the garden.
He's not wrong. That's what I did. But it was more complicated than that. He was only 8. Some things were too heavy for a child that age.
He drew a long breath.
Well, I didn't come back just for him. London was working well for me, professionally. I had everything I needed. The business was solid. But deep down...
He left the sentence hanging as though he didn't know how to finish it. He leaned down and scooped up a handful of earth from the bed beside him, then let it run through his fingers.
When his mother left, I had no reason to stay away from home. What I found here is what keeps me standing. The soil, the plants, the people I work with. Some of them have been here since my father's time. My family, the things that stay when everything else shifts.
He shook the dirt from his hands and turned to me.
I know it sounds naive. People believe you shouldn't get attached to anything because nothing lasts.
He smiled.
But that's not what I do. I don't cling. I take care. That's why the trees my great-grandfather planted still bear fruit.
I looked him straight in the eye, openly, without pretense. A smile spread across my lips that was anything but naive. Julian, I don't imagine you naive. Not for a second. My voice had gone lower than usual. His blue-green eyes narrowed at the corners. He was smiling too. He straightened up, crossing his arms behind his back, as though forbidding himself from moving.
Oh, really? And how do you imagine me?
I had flirted, and now he was flirting back. In an instant, my heart was racing, and already I knew I wasn't ready to take this where it was going. I wasn't shy, but I chose the dodge. Solid as a rock, I said, laughing, stepping away in the same breath. He returned my laugh, eyes teasing. He wasn't fooled. Chapter 7. A Matchmaker. Laura's phone lit up. Chloe's face appeared on the screen. Behind her, a sun-drenched Californian interior, a linen sofa, a dog crossing the frame in no particular hurry. Mom, your skin looks amazing. It's so unfair. Don't be jealous, sweetheart. The light here is softer than in LA. How's Elena? She won't call me back. I left her 3 messages last week and all I got was a heart emoji. 1, no text. Laura settled deeper into the armchair in her bedroom. The door was closed. Downstairs, Elena was at the piano. The sound rose through the floorboards, muffled but unmistakable. Your sister's fine. Much better than I expected, actually. Really? Is she composing? A little. It's coming back, slowly. But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about. Laura paused. Your sister has a sort of flirtation going on with the man who's restoring her garden. Chloe's face froze for half a second. Then her eyes went wide. I'm sorry? You heard me. She hasn't said a word to me. And Ryan? I thought they were together. We only talked about it once. He doesn't seem to be on her mind much. Huh. Chloe took a moment to absorb it. Laura continued. But Julian. His name is Julian? Oh my God, that's so romantic. Julian, the French gardener. It sounds like the opening of a movie. Chloe! No, seriously, Julian, tell me everything. What does he look like? Laura searched for the right words. Very handsome. Dark hair, light eyes, the build of a man who works outdoors. But that's not the most striking thing. He's, how to put it, very calm, grounded. The kind of man who doesn't speak just to fill the silence. Easy to be around. Chivalrous, without overdoing it. Oh boy, it's serious then. Listen, I'm a little worried about your sister. You know she wasn't in a good place when she left a month ago. The label, the award, the pressure. She needed rest, not a love story. That's exactly why. A French fling would do her a world of good. Can you imagine, with all the stress she's been carrying? Let her live a little. A fling. Easy to say. Mom, Elena's always been good at picking guys. She's usually the one who walks away. Sure, the last 2 we saw were gorgeous, but absolutely nothing going on upstairs. Chloe! I'm just saying, but the thing is, she never has time for a personal life. So she always ends up with guys who are musicians like her, or in the industry, and that's the worst thing for her. She needs someone who brings her back down to earth, not someone living in the same bubble. Laura didn't answer right away. Her younger daughter had her flaws, but when it came to her sister, she could sometimes see things clearly. You may be right. It can't hurt her to try something different. Of course I'm right. And you, what are you doing over there? You're not going to spend the whole time spying on them, are you? Laura smiled. I might give her a little nudge. Oh, Mom playing matchmaker. I love it. Keep me posted. And tell Elena to call me back, please. I need to talk to her about something. It's urgent. Chloe. It's nothing big, Mom. Don't worry. Anyway, I have to go. Jake's waiting. We've got brunch. Love you. Kiss Elena. And Julian. Especially Julian. The screen went dark. Laura stayed seated a moment longer. The piano downstairs had stopped, and she heard voices in the garden. She set down her phone and smiled. The invitation had come simply, the way everything did with Julian. That morning, Mark had been more insistent than usual about revisiting the label's latest offer. He couldn't understand my reluctance. How do you explain something you don't understand yourself? I didn't want another contract built on the same style of music, already proven to work.
Elena, you're going to lose this deal if you keep making them wait. I don't understand what's holding you back.
Mark, give me time. I already told you. He didn't let me finish.
It's been over a month now. You've had all the time you need, and they've given you plenty of creative room. Everything's lined up, Elena. The tours, the musicians, you have a say in everything. You just had the crowning moment of your career. Don't throw it all away by hiding out on the other side of the world. This is where it happens.
Mark, I think it's late where you are. You should get some sleep. We'll talk about it later. I hung up on him without a second thought. His tone was getting aggressive from sheer frustration. I didn't need that. On the terrace, Mom and Julian were deep in conversation. She greeted me with the question, "Sweetheart, you'll never guess what Julian's middle name is." Julian nodded to acknowledge me, a thin smile on his lips. No idea. I give up. I took a sip of coffee. Joseph Marie! He has a girl's name. Isn't that the sweetest thing? It's a family tradition, Catholic. All the boys get Marie. Isn't that something? Yes. I couldn't manage more than that. I was already struggling to swallow my coffee. That's how tense I was. Julian hadn't taken his eyes off me since I'd arrived. I'd pinned my hair up, and I could feel the sun on the back of my neck, hotter than usual for that hour of morning. A playful breeze teased the hem of my floral skirt. But it was the warmth of his gaze that made me shiver. On that, I had no doubt. Laura went on. Elena tells me you have a magnificent family estate?
Yes, well, that's where everything started. Elena's seen the commercial side, but the family house is just beyond it.
It must have so much character. I'd love to see it with my own eyes. It was a rather obvious lead. Mom, we can go together sometime. I'm not sure Julian has the time.
Nothing would make me happier than to show you around, Laura. Tomorrow's Friday. Come for dinner. You'll meet my mother and my son.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Should we bring anything? A dish? Wine?
No, absolutely not. My mother takes care of everything. She'd take it as an insult. Come with your daughter. We'll eat outside, and let's hope the weather stays as mild as it's been.
He finished his coffee.
Thank you.
He set down his cup and went back to work. The patio of the Moreau house was bright, bathed in the sun of a May evening. Grandmère Moreau, Giselle, had welcomed us with a wide smile and settled us around the table, where she held court at one end. Arnaud, Julien's older brother, sat at the other, in the middle of some story. His wife, Marie, beside Laura, fielded his jokes and Laura's questions about the region in equal measure. Across from them, Léo and his cousins, Arnaud's 2 children, were eating with the single-minded focus of people who'd been promised dessert. I was seated between Giselle and Léo and across from Julien. The food was generous and homely, a far cry from the refined Parisian restaurants I'd frequented, but with a depth of flavor that swept us away with every dish. The wine was poured freely. The family kept its own cellar, down in the depths of the house. Across from me, Julian was the quietest person at the table. His nature was the first reason for that, but I could see he was under the spell. I had dressed for him, not provocatively, just feminine. When I'd chosen my jewelry, adjusted my makeup, picked my dress, it was already him I was thinking of. It was almost unconscious, and when I'd seen him too, I'd felt my heart beat faster. He hadn't taken his eyes off me, just like yesterday morning on the terrace. Could the others tell? Arnaud drew our attention.
What's interesting is that I've learned that dear Julien has been going to Elena's worksite every single day.
Julien buried his gaze in his plate.
It's a complex project. The garden requires...
Frérot, we have crew leaders for complex projects.
He burst out laughing.
Usually you check in on the site once or twice a week, when you've got time.
This one has specific needs that...
Don't apologize. Come on. Now we all know why.
The whole table laughed in unison. Even the children were stifling giggles. Giselle shook her head with a smile, while Léo was laughing as hard as his uncle. Marie, Arnaud's wife, raised her glass slightly to her husband, and my mother was studying hers with considerable interest. And Julien, after an attempted moment of dignity, laughed too. I stared at my plate, smiling. I loved this warmth, this family atmosphere, no pretenses. Here they'd talked about Elena the musician, but celebrity didn't seem to register with any of them. Across the table, Arnaud caught his wife's eye. She raised an eyebrow. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. He'd understood he shouldn't push it further. They left it there. The drive home was made in darkness. Julien had insisted on taking us back. It was late, and we'd had a few glasses of wine. My mother fell asleep on the back seat before we'd left the domain. Julien drove, and I watched the trees sweep past in the headlights. Neither of us spoke, and a very comfortable silence had settled between us. The radio murmured soft melodies with French accents. We could have talked, but perhaps our voices would have given us away. The car stopped in front of the entrance, and Julien came around to help Laura out. Once inside, she didn't linger. Good night, Julien, and thank you. It was a wonderful evening. She touched my arm once, warm, light, and disappeared down the hall. We were alone, he and I, in the entrance hall, under the dim light of the crystal chandelier. It was I who closed the last step between us. Before my lips found his, I didn't know I was going to kiss him. And the moment he opened his arms for me to slip inside them, I knew I'd been waiting for this all evening. That warm closeness, my body wrapped in his, my heart racing, his scent. I caught my breath, only to fall straight back into the blue-green hold of his gaze. I went back for more, and this time the embrace grew more pressing, more intimate, more demanding. His hand in my hair, pulling me closer.
Elena!
A voice rose calmly, yet it rang like thunder in the silence of the hall. I startled and looked up. Mark was standing in the inner corridor. I'd had no word from him since our conversation the day before, and he hadn't told me he was coming. Hey, Mark, what a surprise! Julien still had his arm around my waist, and I was acutely aware of the space between us, or rather, the absence of it. Mark approached with a slow, deliberate step. He extended his hand to Julien.
Good evening. I'm Mark, Elena's manager.
Julien straightened slightly, his hand leaving my waist a beat late. He shook Mark's hand.
Julien.
Julien Moreau? The landscaper?
The word landscaper landed with just enough weight to mean something.
That's right.
Julien turned to me.
Good night, Elena.
He pressed his lips to my cheek, barely a touch, before leaving. The door closed. Mark looked at me for a moment. His face betrayed nothing, the smooth surface of a man who had spent 20 years solving puzzles. Good trip? I asked.
Excellent. I'm beginning to understand your hesitations.
Mark, I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed. We'll talk tomorrow. Good night.
Good night.
He stood alone in the hall. Chapter 8. An Earthworm in Love with a Star. The morning after the dinner, Arnaud was up early, as was his habit. He started with a walk through the greenhouses, as he always did when he was home. It was 7 o'clock when he made his way to the domain kitchen, drawn by the smell of freshly ground coffee and warm bread. Giselle was standing at the counter, cutting the loaf into even slices. Arnaud came in through the garden door, his boots still damp with dew.
Bonjour, maman.
Bonjour, mon grand. Coffee? He sat down. She set a cup in front of him and glanced toward the stairs.
My brother's not down yet? I expected to find him outside before me, like always.
No. Giselle offered nothing more. Arnaud hid his smile behind his coffee cup. He knew his mother well enough to know that she too had noticed Julian's absence and had drawn the same conclusion about the night before. Giselle sat down across from him, her herbal tea in hand. Arnaud pressed on.
He came back very late, after driving our guests home.
She took a sip, her gaze on the window. It looks like your little brother is in love.
I couldn't agree more, Maman. It's plain as day. He's completely gone. Hook, line, and sinker.
He shook his head, still smiling.
I have to say, Elena is something else. I'd imagine her difficult. The American star, you know. A bit of a diva. I was surprised to find her so natural last night.
Giselle nodded. Your brother has never known what to do with difficult women. She set her cup down. Her fingers stayed wrapped around it, as if for the warmth. Good for him. He hasn't taken the easy road, mind you. Arnaud watched her.
What's worrying you?
Giselle raised her eyes to him. I have these lines, from when I was a girl, that came back to me. Madame, beneath your feet in the shadow, a man stands there who loves you, lost in the night that veils him, who suffers, an earthworm in love with a star, who would give you his soul if it came to that, and who is dying down below while you shine up above. Arnaud frowned.
Yes, that's one of your favorite films, isn't it? La folie des grandeurs? The earthworm in love with a star, for sure.
Yes, but you've forgotten your classics. It's Victor Hugo, first and foremost. His play, Ruy Blas, which the film drew from heavily, even if the ending is nothing alike. Arnaud laughed. A real laugh, open and full. The kind that used to rattle the kitchen windows when he was a boy. Giselle went on, unfazed. Cinema, and even theater, often err on the side of spectacle. But reality can sometimes outdo fiction in its brutality. Arnaud's laughter faded. He set down his cup.
Don't worry yourself, petite mère.
He took her hand, choosing his words carefully.
Julian is solid on the inside. He's come through everything. The little one, especially. It's as though life is calling him again, and he has to answer. He's not going to stay hidden behind his mother's skirts forever.
Giselle said nothing.
Elena is opening his heart back up, Maman. And let's pray it doesn't close again. If it's not with her, he'd be ready for someone else. But at least, let him start living again.
Giselle looked at her eldest son. She nodded. He was right. Footsteps came down the stairs before long. Julian appeared, hair still wet, a fresh shirt, his face not quite awake.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. They answered at the same time. Giselle rose to pour him a coffee. He kissed her on both cheeks, then went to clap his brother on the shoulder.
I woke up absolutely starving.
They didn't speak of it again. Later that morning, Laura found Mark in the small dining room, standing in front of the windows, coffee in hand. He seemed absorbed by the garden. Outside, Julian and Elena were making the rounds. The fountain, the alcove. The garden around them was beautiful now and orderly. Laura sat at the table, an open book in front of her. She was reading, or appeared to be.
How far do you think this is going to go?
Laura didn't look up. She turned a page and chose not to answer.
Laura.
I heard you. She took her time with a sip of coffee. They've been devouring each other with their eyes since the day I arrived. I've never seen Elena like this. She's happy. And Julian is a very good man. She went back to her book.
He's not from her world. He seems like a decent guy, sure, but he has no idea what Elena's life is, what it costs, what it demands.
Laura closed her book, slowly, taking the time to choose her words. She looked up. For once, Mark, mind your own business. He didn't rise to it, waiting for the rest. That's not what she pays you for. He said nothing, his eyes fixed on what was happening on the other side of the glass. Laura reopened her book. Chapter 9. a star in the middle of nowhere. Mark had been there for a week. My mother had left for a few days to visit a friend in the south of France, and I found him alone at the kitchen table that morning. In front of him, spread on the table, coffee, open laptop, open folders, the full spread of a man who'd been working for a while already. A fairly comfortable silence settled between us, but I wasn't fooled. I knew he'd come back to it. This time, though, I was ready. Or I thought I was.
Where do things stand with the label?
He asked without looking up from his screen. Not ready yet.
They're getting impatient, Elena.
I know.
The tracks you sent them, they're thrilled. It's not your usual register, and that's exactly what excites them. They're talking about a turning point, an event.
I tightened my hands around my cup. I'm not ready to think about that.
I know, just keeping you in the loop.
He closed the laptop and looked at me for the first time.
Can I ask you something?
You're going to anyway.
Are you in love with him?
I looked at my coffee. I didn't answer right away, which was an answer in itself.
Elena.
Mark, I've never felt anything like this. With anyone. Mark let a moment pass.
Have you thought about what that means, practically? Your life is in Los Angeles. The tour contract is on the table. The label's waiting. Everything you've built.
I know what I've built.
Then you know it's not compatible with what you're doing here.
You don't know what you're talking about, Mark. I could feel the irritation rising at having him lecture me. Mark must have sensed it. He softened his tone and changed tack. I knew him inside out.
You're right. I'm sorry.
He took a sip from his cup.
I'm just worried, that's all. You're vulnerable right now. You came here to find yourself again, and instead you found someone. And Elena, he's a landscaper. A good one, clearly. A good man, probably. But he has no idea what your world is, what it costs, what it takes.
I said nothing. Mark leaned slightly toward me, his brow faintly creased.
Where is he this morning, by the way?
I looked at my cup. Again. He had something to deal with at the office.
Right.
Something in his tone made me look up. What?
Nothing.
Mark. He held my gaze.
Leo's mother arrived last night.
How do you know that?
It's my job to know things. That's what you pay me for, isn't it?
He took his time before going on.
She comes back every few months, apparently. Always unannounced. She stays. Julian lets her stay. For Leo. There's a whole story underneath that he hasn't told you, Elena. She comes back. She cries. She says she wants to try again.
Where are you getting all this?
It doesn't matter where.
It matters to me. Mark held my gaze.
I'm telling you this because I don't want you caught off guard. That's all. I've always protected you. You know that.
I looked out at the garden through the window. Everything seemed empty. Had Julian lied? Even if Leo's mother was there, why lie about it if there was nothing to hide between them? Something murky was rising inside me. I left the room without a word. Mark didn't stop me. Evening was falling over the garden, bathing it in a bluish light. The fountain trickled lazily, and the air had turned cool. I was on the swing seat, in the alcove Julian had finished the week before. Knees drawn up, a glass of wine I hadn't touched beside me. I heard the gate open in the distance. A few moments later, Julian was crossing the garden in his work clothes. He looked tired, and his eyes lit up when he saw me. He came close and leaned down to kiss my cheek. I let him, without reacting. He straightened up and looked at me, then sat down across from me.
What's wrong?
I wasn't in the mood for guessing games. I wanted to know. You said you had work this morning. He froze, then exhaled slowly. Something in my tone must have alerted him.
Leo's mother arrived last night. I wasn't expecting it.
So it wasn't work after all.
I needed to deal with it before I talked to you about it. She's unpredictable. I didn't want it to become...
I didn't wait for him to finish. In my world, everyone has hidden agendas, Julian. Everyone says what they think you need to hear and hides the rest. Everyone lies. Everyone conceals. I raised my eyes to hold his. I thought you were different. Julian leaned toward me.
I am different, and you know it. I made a bad call this morning. I should have told you right away. I'm sorry.
His phone rang. He glanced at the screen and answered.
Yes, son.
He listened.
All right. Go to Mimi's tonight. Elena and I need to talk.
He hung up.
That was Leo. His mother's taken a hotel in the end. She won't be staying at the Domain.
He drew a deep breath.
Come to the Domain tonight. It's quiet. Leo's at my mother's. And you and I need to finally be alone.
I wanted so badly for it to be that simple. The garden around us, the fountain, the climbing rose along the wall. I gave in with a smile. He'd kept his hand over mine for the whole drive, lifting it only when the road demanded both hands.
I need a shower the second we get there. I'll set you up in the salon, nice and comfortable, and then I'll cook. Sounds all right?
Everything sounded all right. The car turned into the Domain's drive. Headlights on gravel, dark fields on either side. The family house visible at the end, lit from within. And then flashes everywhere, all at once. Blinding. 6, maybe 8 photographers burst from both sides of the drive, from behind the stone wall, from the ditch, from the darkness where they'd been waiting. Their shutters crackled as they screamed my name.
What the hell?
He accelerated, past the gates. They closed behind us. He killed the engine, and silence wrapped around us. Raindrops began to fall on the car. Outside, the flashes kept going beyond the gate, the paparazzi still calling my name at the top of their lungs. If I'd had any distance in that moment, I might have seen how absurd their presence was in a place like this. Julian was stunned, as if his senses had left him. I was already on the phone. It rang once. This situation, at least, I knew.
Elena?
Mark, there are paparazzi at the gates of the Domain.
I'm sending a car. Stay inside.
Hurry. I hung up. The rain intensified, suddenly, violently. The windshield filled with water. I looked at the gate, the flashes still going, behind it, despite the rain. Julian looked at me, his hand finding mine on the seat. "Don't touch me!" I'd almost shouted, but my voice was shaking. "You're either the worst or the best. I don't know anymore." He said nothing. "Did you set this up? With her? For what, your 15 minutes? Your story with the American star?" The idea shocked him so deeply he found his voice again.
You really think I would do that to you?
"Then explain to me what they're doing here, at your home, at this hour." I'm not naive. Someone tipped them off. Otherwise, I can't see what they'd be doing out here in the middle of nowhere. My eyes filled. I didn't cry. I'm so stupid. Oh my God.
Elena, calm down, please. You know I could never do something like that. I'm completely lost. I don't understand what just happened. Wait, we'll find an explanation.
The rain hammered the roof. I shook my head slowly. No, we won't find anything. I'm staying here only because I can't go inside your house or step out in the rain to have my picture taken by your friends. But for the love of God, I need silence. Headlights soon appeared at the end of the drive. Mark had come with the security team. He knocked on my window. I opened the door and stepped out without looking back. Julian stayed in his car. The drive had emptied behind her, his hand still on the gear stick where he'd stopped himself from touching her. Chapter 10. A Mother's Call. Provence in June smelled of thyme and warm stone. Laura was on the terrace of her friend Clémence's house in Lourmarin, a glass of rosé in front of her and a book she was no longer reading. Her phone, set on the table, remained stubbornly silent. She had called Elena twice that morning, without reply. She'd sent her 4 messages, light at first, then increasingly worried. "Everything all right? Sweetheart, call me back when you can." "Elena, I'm getting seriously worried. Just give me a word." Elena had left her a very confused voicemail the night before, a voice she hadn't recognized at first, brief, broken.
Mom, it's over with Julian. He's not who I thought. I'm coming home tomorrow. I'll explain. Don't worry.
And then the line had gone quiet, silent all night and all morning. Laura knew her daughter. Elena was not the kind to disappear or to run. She knew how to face things. If she had chosen to slip away like this, something serious had happened. And Laura had no one to turn to. Mark was out of the question. Chloe would only make it worse. That left Giselle. They'd spoken twice in all, once at the dinner at the Domain and once on the phone, briefly, about practical matters. But Laura had kept her number. She hesitated one more second, then pressed the button. 3 rings. Allô? Bonjour, Giselle. It's Laura, Elena's mother. I'm sorry to bother you.
Bonjour, Laura.
Giselle's voice was immediately attentive, as though she'd been expecting the call. I gather there was some kind of incident last night, but I don't know more than that. I'm in Provence for a few days, and I can't reach Elena anymore. She won't answer my calls or my messages. Please, if you know what happened, tell me. She left me a message last night. She was beside herself. The silence at the other end lasted a moment. Then, I don't know where Elena is, but there was indeed an incident last night. Giselle sighed. What I know, I have from Leo. In short, it started with the unannounced arrival of Leo's mother. She has a way of being unpredictable. Julian didn't want to tell Elena about it, and, caught off guard, he lied about where he was that morning. She went on. I don't know exactly what played out after that, but the upshot is that last night Elena and Julian came here together, to the Domain. Leo was with me, and his mother had left over an hour before. But when they reached the gate, photographers were waiting for them. Laura closed her eyes. Oh no. Elena thinks Julian is the one who tipped them off. Laura felt her stomach tighten. Oh no, he would never do that, not Julian. No. Giselle let the word hang for a moment. Listen, Laura, I know they're not children anymore, and I'm not here to plead my son's case. He's old enough to do that himself if he wants to. But Julian, he's a strong man, and he's had his share of hardship. I believe he's strong enough to come through this if Elena decides to end things between them. And Elena too, of course. She paused. But he is not a dishonest man, nor a self-interested one. Tell her that. No one in this family would have done such a thing. Laura drew a long breath. The rosé on the table had warmed in the sun. She didn't touch it. You don't need to tell me, Giselle. Her voice trembled slightly. She steadied herself. You know, Elena doesn't lead a normal life. The people around her always have their own interests. Always. Since she was 19. And she's learned to protect herself in a certain way. One that serves her in her career, but betrays her in her personal life. She stopped, looked at her glass, picked it up, set it back down without drinking. Thank you for telling me. I'll leave you now. I hope to see you again soon. Likewise, Laura. Laura hung up. She stayed on the terrace for a long time. The sun was beginning to drop behind the hills. Somewhere in the village, a church bell struck the hour. She picked up her phone, tried Elena once more. No answer. Laura set it face down on the table. She picked up her glass and drank it in one go. Chapter 11. A Father's Loss. The next morning, I woke up to a soft knock on my bedroom door. Yes? My throat was raw, and an entire orchestra was pounding inside my skull. It's Marguerite, madame. I'm sorry to disturb you, but Monsieur Grant insists I let you know that the plane you ordered will be here in 3 hours. She paused, perhaps waiting for an answer that didn't come. He's concerned you may not have time to get ready. Thank you, Marguerite. Tell him I'm coming. Mark had moved fast. The memory of the night before was coming back to me in pieces, surfacing as Marguerite spoke and the sleeping pill wore off. As soon as we'd returned to the house, I'd asked Mark to arrange our departure for the following morning. The sensations from the night before came back intact. My stomach clenched as if a fist were tightening inside it. My palms went clammy. Tears rose to my eyes. I wanted to curl up and sleep, so I did the exact opposite. I got out of bed, determined to freshen up. If I'd learned one thing from Julian, it was that action and fresh air heal a good many sorrows. Mark was ready to leave when I came downstairs. There was no reason to linger, in his view. 2 hours later, we were settled in the jet that was waiting for us.
Right then, homeward bound.
Mark didn't hide his enthusiasm. I felt none. Home to me now meant the beautiful garden Julian had brought back to life. The Seine visible over the fence. Champagne would help me hold together during the flight. But first, I had to let my mother know. I'd left her a muddled message the night before, then switched off my phone to resist the temptation of answering Julian's calls. Or worse, calling him myself and letting the pain explode. But it was now 3 p.m. in France, and she'd be starting to worry. My phone showed 15 missed calls, 12 from Julian and 3 from my mother. And 3 voice notes from Julian. What was the point of listening? I put in my earphones and called Laura first. Mark moved further away to give me some privacy. At first she didn't say much, as stunned as I'd been. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry. That must have been a terrible evening. It's more than that, Mom. I never would have imagined this from Julian. I've had my share of low blows, of people with agendas. But this one, I really didn't see it coming. She said nothing for a moment. Honey, why not listen to what he has to say? You know Julian well enough to know he wouldn't do something like this, and neither would anyone in his family. But it did happen, Mom, and not at my place, at his. I'd wanted her to back me completely, and her stance was throwing me off. I don't have all the details, Mom, but Julian may not be the good Samaritan you seem so willing to take at face value. They have a comfortable life, sure, but let's be clear, I'm leagues above all of this. He'd have a lot to gain by showing off our flirtation. Not necessarily. Mom! Sweetheart, calm down. She sighed. Elena, you're making a mistake. I wish so much you could see it and turn around. The world you live in is completely warped by money, by the media, by all the rest. Julian isn't as wealthy as you, and nobody knows him beyond his own world. Your face is everywhere on the planet. But Julian doesn't need you. You're wrong if you think he does. I didn't interrupt her because it was the first time she'd ever spoken to me this way. Something in her voice, in her words, made me wish she'd stop and simply hold me, the way she used to when I was a little girl. Elena, she went on, he's a man of integrity who lives by his values, and that can't be bought. And believe me, that's the very quality you admired in him. She paused, perhaps before landing the final blow. In the end, are you leaving or are you running away? Because Mom, the plane's about to take off. I have to go. We'll talk later. I hung up before she could answer. My head was spinning. Had I made the wrong decision? My phone was still flashing. The voice notes. I summoned my nerve. The first had come in at 9 p.m., just after I'd left. He must have still been parked in his drive. I could hear the rain drumming on the car roof.
Elena, it's me. I know you won't pick up, and I understand. But I can't let tonight be the last thing between us. I don't know who tipped off those photographers. It wasn't me. I don't understand any of it, none of it. But I swear on everything I have, on my son, on the domain, on everything, it wasn't me. Call me back, please.
He had sent the second just after midnight. He sounded calmer, his voice low. The rain had faded away. He must have been inside the family house by then.
It's me again. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. I should have told you about Leo's mother this morning. I was wrong. I tried to shield you from something complicated, and instead, I lied to you. Listen, let's talk about it calmly, whenever you feel ready. I can't sleep, so I imagine you can't either. Elena, trust me, please. We can get through this together. Just call me.
The third was from this morning, 11:30. I pressed play. A long silence first, then his voice, different, more measured.
Elena, I'm outside your house and the security team won't let me in. They've asked me not to come back or it'll be considered harassment. All right. I didn't expect. But this is probably how things work in your world. I don't know if you'll listen to this, but I came to tell you something this morning. And I don't know if this is the moment, but I have no other choice, do I?
He went on, more slowly, as though choosing each word with care.
When Leo was 5, his mother and I had a second child, a little girl. She was born on the Tuesday in spring. She weighed almost nothing. Her little face had the perfect features of a gift from heaven. Her skin, the softness of angels' wings.
His voice trembled slightly, a shiver barely perceptible. He stopped, then went on.
A few days later.
His voice died away, leaving those few words suspended for a moment.
She stayed with us for a few days, and then she was gone. The doctor spoke of a condition present from birth, one they hadn't been able to detect earlier. There was nothing to be done, they said. Sooner or later, it would have surfaced.
Another silence before he went on.
Our marriage didn't survive. It's more complicated than that. I'll spare you the details, but that's where everything broke. We tried our best to pick up life as if nothing had happened, but we were no longer alive, either of us. Leo's mother eventually went back to her family in Thailand, leaving me full custody.
He paused again.
I'm telling you all this for 2 reasons. The first, I could never ask her to leave our lives because beyond Leo, we share that grief. I know what she went through, the hell she crossed, the thing that still eats at her 11 years on. She's moved on with her life. She's had another child, but she was never the same again.
A silence.
Neither was I, for that matter. I discovered depths inside me where the light doesn't reach, where reason is nothing but an illusion.
A breath.
The second thing, Elena, comes from that experience. I learned that even pure bliss may last only a moment. If you decide that staying with me would cost you too much, know that I understand. The distance between our worlds is immense. I understand all of that. So if you leave, don't leave anything behind. No regret, no remorse. Be free of it all, and I'll do the same.
The message cut off there, on that sentence. The phone in my hands, the earphones still in my ears. I don't know how long I sat there, crying. The tears fell on their own, and I could find no strength inside me to stop them, or even to think. The plane had taken off. Don't hold on to me. Even pure bliss may last only a moment. I closed my eyes. I saw Julian, a newborn girl in his arms, the happiness, and then death, the bottomless terror. I already knew I'd made the wrong decision. Now I sensed it would never leave me. Chapter 12. A long-distance silence. June 1st. Hi, Julian. It took me a week to write back, and I'm sorry. It's just that I don't even know where to start. I listened to your messages on the plane, all 3, and I listened again, and again.
Your little girl. Julian, your little girl.
I don't know what to say. There probably isn't anything to say, but I want you to know that I heard you, every word,
And that it broke something inside me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For your daughter. For everything.
July 1st. Hi, Julian. It's Elena. I've tried to reach you a few times. Anyway, I got a message from Leo a few days ago. He told me what his mother admitted to you, that it was Mark who contacted her in London where she'd gone back to live. He's the one who asked her to come and stir things up. But she changed her mind once she was there. She called Mark to say she was pulling out and going to a hotel. Leo thinks, and she does too, that it was at that point Mark got the idea for the paparazzi. You and me, alone at the domain that evening. Mark did all of it, start to finish. I confronted him. He didn't deny it, for my own good, of course. It didn't even make me angry. It made me sad. I'm asking for your forgiveness, Julian. I couldn't even trust my own instinct. You deserved better than that. You didn't answer my last message. It's not a reproach, but I'd be lying if I said your silence doesn't weigh on me. Is this your way of letting time do its work? I know you're not a big talker, but don't you miss me? Even a little? Listen, it's summer. Why don't you come to Los Angeles for a few weeks? I think it would be good if we could see each other and talk about all of this.
Please, answer me.
September 1st. Hi, Julian. I've composed something, a song. It swept me away. I've been playing non-stop for weeks. Actually, since I got back, I've been glued to my piano. The music is back. The piece is called Even Pure Bliss May Last Only a Moment. It's for you. You remember that line from your message? Anyway, it'll be on the album I'm working on, an album different from anything I've ever done. I wish so much you could see this. Please, answer me. I'm starting to feel like I'm talking to myself. November 1st. No message. An audio file attached. 63 minutes of music. December 1st. Julian. Marguerite called me yesterday. She wanted to know if I'd like the house closed up for the winter, or if I was planning to come back soon. I told her I didn't know yet. And then she told me your crew came by last week. They prepared the garden one last time for the cold. Protected the roses, covered the young plants, drained the fountain. You can't imagine. I've been counting the days since we parted. Well, since I left, like a fury. You haven't answered me once in nearly 6 months, or picked up a single call. All right, I'm not used to it. Fine. Some days, I wonder if you're playing a game, and then I'm furious at myself for imagining I could fall for something so obvious. And the very next second, I realized that if you cared about me even a little, you'd have claimed your victory by now. And believe me, I would have savored my defeat. I admit you've won everything, Julian. I don't want to play. I know I deserve this silence. But I hope that you're listening. Please answer me. February 3rd. Julian, the first single comes out next week. The label didn't believe in it at first. Too far from my usual register. No catchy chorus, 7 minutes of piano and strings. And then they listened, and they had nothing left to say. I'm calling about something else. I wanted you to hear it from me before the press gets hold of it. All the rights to this song, every last one, 100%, will go to children's hospitals. In the United States, in Europe, but also in Africa, Latin America, Asia, everywhere it's possible. I've been in touch with organizations that look after sick children, that support their families. I feel alive again, Julian. bringing a little joy to these people. It's extraordinary how you can be dead inside without knowing it, until one day you find the spark again. Oh, and Happy New Year. March 2nd. Julian, please, answer me. I know this is who you are. I know it, I understand it, and some days I accept it, but other days, like today, I miss you so much. 9 months. Julian, you're driving me crazy. Do you still think about me? I do. Every day. Please, Julian. I'd sworn to myself I'd stop sending you messages, that I'd stop thinking about you at all. My God, is that how people feel when... Listen, I'll be traveling a lot over the next 2 months. You remember the children's charities? I'm finally going to meet them on the ground in 6 countries, India and Sri Lanka, then Bolivia and Brazil, and finally Cameroon and Kenya. I'm going incognito. The logistics weren't simple to organize, but we got there. I leave tomorrow morning. When it's over, I think I'll have drawn a line under us. Leo bounded up the stairs whistling, 2 at a time. His hiking trip with Mika and Tomeo was taking shape. All that was left was to talk his father into the car. He pushed open the study door without knocking and stopped dead. His father was standing behind his oak drafting table, his phone in front of him, a voice note playing. Julian's face was still, but his eyes were not. Leo froze in the doorway. He recognized the voice coming from the phone, barely audible, but clear in the silence of the study. Please, answer me. Elena. Something in her voice hurt him, as if he could feel her pain. He listened to the rest of the message, too stunned to speak. The message ended. Julian set the phone face down on the desk, slowly. Papa, was that Elena? Julian looked up.
Yes.
Leo stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and came closer. I didn't know you were still in touch. Julian didn't answer right away. He was looking at his phone. Papa, I heard her message. Have there been others?
Yes.
How many? Julian hesitated.
Does it matter?
Leo's eyes widened. And you've never answered? The silence in the study was thick. The ticking of the old clock on the shelf. The sound of March rain on the glass roof outside.
No.
But why? His voice had risen, a note of frustration in it.
Leo.
No, Papa, but why? It sounds like she loves you. Julian looked at him.
I don't know, son.
Leo felt something rising inside him. A mix of surprise, confusion, and something else he couldn't name. Disappointment? What do you mean you don't know? Are you joking? Dad, she's practically begging you. Did you hear her voice? His own voice had gone up a notch. He realized it too late. He saw his father's expression change, demanding, without a word, that he lower his tone. Leo took a breath. Julian waited for him to come back to himself. Then he spoke, more steadily.
Nothing's stopping her from coming back, Leo. She may love me, or maybe I've become a kind of idol for her. Something she can idealize from a distance. I don't know.
He paused.
But if she truly wants a life together, she'll come back.
Leo let his father's words settle. But why don't you ask her to come back? Julian looked at him for a long time, and something shifted across his face, a bitter half-smile that didn't look like him.
Let me tell you something, Leo. Certain things, the most important ones, can only come from you. If someone tries to force them on you, threatens, pressures, begs you, you might give in for a while, but in time, you'll regret it. That's how life works. Elena has to choose, and I must not beg, or she might come back out of pity. And then what?
As he spoke, Julian's voice had grown deeper, heavier. Leo measured the full weight of emotion it held, and that his father was fighting to contain. It was the first time in a very long while that his father had been vulnerable in front of him. Almost 12 years. Leo remembered vaguely the weeks after his little sister's death. He was small, but he knew. His father who stopped eating, who stopped talking, who sat for hours staring at the walls, his mother crying in the next room, and between them, a 5-year-old boy who didn't know where to put himself. Leo looked at his father, really looked, and he saw the pain in his eyes, the loss that had to be absorbed. Leo didn't know how to comfort him, but he sensed his father wouldn't want to break down in front of him. Not now, not like this. So he did something else. Okay, this is grown-up stuff anyway. Girls my age are much easier, trust me. He managed to smile and was relieved to see his father do the same. Hey, I came to ask if you're cool with me going hiking for a few days with Mika and Timeo.
Yes, but you tell me exactly where, and especially when.
Deal. I'll let you know as soon as we've got it sorted.
He was already walking quickly toward the door. We might need a car, I'll tell you. Bye. Then he was out, fast, without looking back. Julian was still smiling. His son looked more and more like him. Chapter 13. A Brother's Plea. The evening sun, still high at 7, hung over the patio, and the light fell at a slant across the table, golden, thick, the light of summer evenings that never seemed to end. Julian and Arnaud sat on either side of the table, a beer in front of each. Arnaud had his sleeves rolled up and his feet on the chair opposite him. Julian sat straight, forearms on the table, his hands around his bottle. They hadn't spoken for a while. A companionable silence held them together in the sunlit languor of the evening. Julian's phone buzzed on the table. He looked down, looked at the screen, picked up the phone, brought it to his ear and listened in silence. June 8th. Julian, I'm here. I'm home. The garden is beautiful, even more beautiful than when I left. I think I need to see you. I need this silence to end, one way or another. Perhaps you don't. You clearly don't. But I do. So tell me, do I come to the domain, or do you come to me? If you don't answer, I'll come to the domain tomorrow at the end of the day, and I'll wait, as long as it takes. A few seconds. He set the phone back on the table, slowly, closed his eyes. Elbows on his knees, he clenched his fists and pressed his closed eyes against them. The sun on his face, the sound of birds in the orchard, far off. Everything else had disappeared. He had completely forgotten his brother was there. Arnaud watched him in silence. He could feel the emotion but couldn't see the cause, unless... He waited a moment. Then,
It's her, isn't it? Elena?
Julian opened his eyes, surprised.
I don't need to be a mind reader, frérot. I just have to look at your face.
Julian looked at his beer, then at the garden. He opened up to his brother, a rare thing.
She says she's here, back at her place, and she wants to see me.
Arnaud raised his eyebrows.
Just like that? After a year of silence?
Julian shook his head.
She hasn't exactly been silent. It's more complicated than that.
How so?
She's called a few times. Sent voice notes too.
He took a swig of beer. His gaze avoided his brother's.
Right, so she sent you what, 1 or 2 messages?
8.
Arnaud let out a low whistle.
Not bad.
He let a moment pass.
So why have you been walking around like a pallbearer all this time? I mean, if you're writing to each other.
He stopped mid-sentence. His brother had said she, but not I, not we.
And you, did you ever answer?
Silence.
Pick up her calls? Call back?
Arnaud stared at him in silence, increasingly incredulous.
I see. You gave her the silent treatment for 12 months?
It's not a silent treatment.
Julian set down his beer.
I was giving her room to walk away for good. If I'd answered, the connection would still be there, you know? She'd have stayed tied to me, and I didn't want to tie her down.
Arnaud nodded slowly.
And did it work?
What?
The open door. Did she stop calling or leaving notes?
Julian didn't answer right away.
Actually, no. She didn't stop. She'd send a message from time to time.
He took a sip.
She didn't stop.
He repeated it, lower. Arnaud said nothing. He watched his brother. He waited. Julian went on, his eyes on his bottle.
I didn't want to go back into that. I got attached too fast and too hard.
He paused, then admitted.
I'm with her. It's worse than anything. It hurts like hell.
Arnaud softened his voice.
I know, brother. You were a wreck for a few weeks after she left.
Bit of an exaggeration, no?
If you say so.
Arnaud picked up his beer, took a long swig, set it back down.
But she held on. Even when that wasn't your plan, you've just pulled off something I've never seen before.
He paused.
Honestly, first time in my life. So Elena is the one trying to sort things out while you're hiding in your shell?
Julian didn't answer. Arnaud smiled.
A woman like that could have anyone she wants. She's incredibly beautiful. And you, not only are you not chasing her, you're running away. And somehow, for a reason I really can't guess, she won't let go. And now, she's decided to take the bull by the horns. And is asking you to come over. That about right?
Shut up. But yes. Except it's not a game for me, Arnaud.
Arnaud didn't reply. He knew his brother. He'd seen him suffer, lower than low, in places no one could follow. He'd watched him get back up, slowly, in silence, with that quiet stubbornness that was his hallmark. And he felt Julian deserved this happiness, the one Julian had resolved never to find again. He picked up his beer, finished it.
Julien, let her in. You're the wisest of us. You've proved it. Well done. Now stop being an idiot and just go with it, all right?
Julian looked at the garden, the orchard in the distance. He sighed.
I know. Maybe I'll go see her tomorrow. It's late now and...
No, man. Go now.
But...
Go now. Stop thinking. You're going to tie your brain in knots.
Julian looked at him. Arnaud held his gaze, not laughing this time. Julian smiled, stood up.
Right, see you later.
Arnaud raised his empty beer in salute. Julian crossed the patio, took his keys from the low wall, opened the door of his pickup. Arnaud sat alone at the table in the evening light. He smiled. Chapter 14. A Piano Serenade. I was anxious. The day had been exhausting. The flight, an interview at one of the big Paris studios before I could finally set my bags down at home. I'd sent Julian a message the moment the doors were closed, and since then I'd managed to unwind under a long shower. I'd gotten into the habit of not keeping my phone on me at all times, officially so it wouldn't become an obsession. In truth, I'd adopted the habit to resist the sometimes stubborn urge to check whether Julian had answered or called. In a year, he never had. And my phone had drifted further and further away. Some days, like today, I thought myself an idiot for waiting around for a man to give me a sign. It had never happened to me before, not once. Chloe, ever the teasing sister, had reminded me that even when we were young, I'd only ever had admirers, never real heartbreak. I'd told her I hadn't been in love back then, and yet I felt I'd had 2 fairly serious disappointments as an adult. Though I'd gotten over both quickly enough, taking refuge in music. But now, as Chloe put it, I was running on empty. Unable to take a single step away from him, even though there had always been at least an ocean between us all this time. Julian had no social media accounts. Leo had one, which I followed discreetly, but he seldom posted photos of his father. It had happened once in a year, and I'd taken a screenshot I sometimes stared at for long stretches. It was truly hopeless. This was usually the point where I'd feel the need to think about something else. Or better, to stop thinking altogether. My feet carried me to the studio. Music had become my refuge again, and I gave myself over to it without restraint. I lit candles. I wanted the room to stay dim. I began with simple pieces, loosening my fingers, working my wrists. Then I replayed a few tracks from my latest album, but I'd perhaps practiced them too much lately, and the rhythm brought no relief. I let myself be swept away by a classical opera I'd always loved, an ode to timeless love. As in life, the opening bars were light, almost a whisper. Then the theme settled in, bright, swelling, filling the room with joyful flights. Then the sky darkened. The chords grew heavier, deeper. The melody lost itself in a frenzy of feelings impossible to name, let alone control. Then came the explosion, unrestrained, betrayal, or love shattering into 1,000 pieces against the wall of cowardice. And the breath falls. Yesterday's proud lovers, invincible in their panache, become tomorrow's defeated, bitter and cynical. Or else, and this was always the surprise, they became the penitent, begging, crawling, crying out beyond all reason, to love that always rises from its ashes, for those who believe, serene now, eternal. I had forgotten everything for the span of an ode to love. I was no longer myself. I was my fingers on my piano. With the last notes, my shoulders dropped. I could feel the smile on my lips. I opened my eyes. When had I closed them? I felt his presence before I saw him. He stood in the doorway, motionless, eyes wide open, seized. Perhaps he had seen a ghost. To me, it felt as though I was seeing one. Julian. What if I stood up and then realized it was an apparition, risen straight from my sheet music, come to taunt me? I decided not to move so as not to break the spell. My eyes, poor things, were trapped. After so long without resting on him, they took him in without the slightest shame. His blue-green eyes, his broad, square shoulders. He hadn't changed. He spoke first.
Bonsoir, Elena. Sorry to disturb you. Marguerite let me up. I could hear the music from downstairs, but I didn't dare interrupt.
Disturb me? After a year? I said nothing. This time I was the one without words. I kept staring at him. After all, after 12 months of talking to a wall, I could afford to hold my silence for a few moments. I'd missed the sound of his voice, deep, steady. It was exactly like the voice notes I'd listened to dozens of times, alone, when the longing became physical. I stood up. I don't know why.
You asked me to come.
I walked toward him. I saw him flinch, almost a half step back that he caught before it landed. Was he afraid? Of me? I stopped when there was only one step left between us. I've asked you so many things these past months. To forgive me, to talk to me, whether you still thought about me. His gaze held mine.
Elena, have mercy on me. I don't know how to play games, not when it comes to love.
So, it is love between us? He didn't answer. I took his hand in both of mine. He didn't pull away. Julian, tell me, is it love?
You don't know, Elena.
How would I know? You've been silent for so long. I caught my breath. I had to tell him everything. His hand in mine gave me courage. I love you, Julian, but I think you know that. And my heart bled for that little girl who was your daughter, for your pain, and even for her mother's. My throat closed. I shut my eyes for a moment, holding back the flood that threatened to spill over. Not now. He hadn't answered either, and the thought hurt. What if I was wrong? I let my hand fall slowly, but he didn't let go. I lifted my eyes to his. I know I hurt you, but does that mean you give up? That you give up on me? He closed the last step between us, and then I was in his arms.
Elena, of course I love you. You're my heart. If you'd been here, close to me, I wouldn't have lasted a day. But the distance made it easier. Now I know you've made your choice.
I don't know how long we stayed like that, holding each other, in that silent reunion. Then gently he asked for a kiss, and I gave it back. My heart surrendered without a last cry. More than the touch of his mouth on mine, the strength that he irradiated carried me to a place I'd never known. An infinite tenderness rose inside of me, and a longing to stay like this, in his arms, beyond time. The tears fell on my cheeks before I knew I was crying. He drew back gently and looked at me, uncertain.
Elena,
He said after a moment.
I didn't keep silent to hurt you or to teach you a lesson. I was giving you space to change your mind. You weren't ready for us when all of that happened, and I nearly lost my mind when you left.
I let him speak. He was right.
You had to follow your heart, and I'm glad it brought you back here.
You're right. I had to come back on my own. I took a breath and said softly what was still weighing on me. But the silence, Julian. I can't go through that again. He smiled.
I wouldn't be able to. Not the second time.
He went on, more serious now.
But you can't run away a second time either. You know my life is here, and I know yours is 10,000 miles from here. So how will we do this?
His hand around my waist trembled slightly as he finished. I was beginning to know him. He was nervous. My mother has grown very fond of this house. She's come back often, you know that. She's going to move in full time. As for me, Monsieur Moreau, all I need is a studio. Why not a room upstairs at the domain with a view over the orchards? It would be a beautiful place to compose. He rested his forehead against mine and closed his eyes. He exhaled so deeply that I felt it in the deepest part of me. This was a moment of magic, one I would carry with me always. Some moments last a lifetime.
Epilogue.
The twins hadn't moved through the entire story. Marcel was lying flat on his stomach on a Persian rug, chin in his hands. Laura had pulled a cushion against her and was hugging her knees. Their eyes were wide open. Leo looked at them. He smiled. And that's how the next morning Papa showed up with Elena for breakfast. He paused, and she never left again. The twins looked at each other. Marcel opened his mouth. Laura was faster. She does leave, for concerts.
And Mammy Laura moved into the garden house, Marcel added.
The room burst into laughter. Julian, from his armchair, shook his head with a half smile. Arnaud laughed openly, feet on the coffee table, a glass in hand. Grand-mère Giselle, tucked into her corner of the sofa, her knitting on her lap, let out a sound that resembled laughter, but that she would never have admitted to. And from the threshold of the salon door, a voice rose, warm, amused, with an accent that had never quite faded. Well, I see my reputation precedes me. Elena stood in the doorway, a shawl over her shoulders. Laura just behind her, a knowing smile on her lips. The twins leapt up. Maman! They crashed into her full force, one around the waist, the other by the arm. She caught them laughing, pulled them close, kissed the tops of their heads. Has your brother been telling you nonsense? No! He told us how you and Papa fell in love. Elena raised her eyes to Leo over the tops of the twins' heads. And he didn't leave anything out? Leo held her gaze. That look of complicity they'd shared for 13 years, since the day he'd recognized the famous artist and said nothing. I did my best. Elena smiled. Julian had come over. He lifted the children off their mother one by one. First Marcel, then Laura. Then he leaned in, winked at his wife, and swept her into a Hollywood kiss that drew laughter, whistles, and applause. Laura had settled onto the sofa beside Grand-mère Moreau. They exchanged a knowing look. Arnaud raised his glass.
To homecomings.
Everyone raised theirs. The spring night outside was gentle. Through the salon window, the orchard was invisible in the dark, but you knew it was there, vast, silent, with its 1,000 trees planted by a great-grandfather still bearing fruit. The twins settled back onto the rug. Marcel turned to Leo.
And then what? What happened after that?
Leo laughed.
After that
Is now.